Hello, bread folk. Thank you for all of your yeasty comments and your flowery likes. They have truly baked a wonderful loaf of bread, and I thank you. For this week's video, I'm doing something unscripted because for right now, I'm working on a longer-term project about the American dream and about how the ideas of freedom and the free markets have become intertwined with this idea in a way that, well, I think that it would benefit us all to be able to untangle the three by studying how they evolved between the 1600s and today. Because, by golly, there's been a lot of time since the first person had an American dream. By the way, this is another project that's going to be open to contribution, so if you want to tell me how you feel about the American dream or your feelings on free markets, if you just want to take the piss out of Adam Smith for a second, I would be glad to accept comments, videos. I'll give you an email link if you'd like to send a video or audio. It's all good to me. I will find a way to work it in. So what I'm going to talk about today is another thing that I want to do a much larger video on later. I feel like I should do some research, even though this is something that was like deeply personal for me, but I feel like I should get a little bit of a refresher because it's been close to a decade. But between 2012 and 2013, I was heavily involved in the Occupy movement. And the first thing that I want to clarify, and this is because there needs to be a similar decoupling and untangling that I mentioned earlier between the concepts of Occupy Wall Street specifically and the Occupy movement. Occupy Wall Street is the first encampment. It is the first place where people said, we are going to camp out here and demand change. Occupy Wall Street is the inspiration for the Occupy movement, but it is not the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement ended up doing something that was far more beautiful than Occupy Wall Street ever could. And that's what I'd like to explain today. In how Occupy taught me what it is to be an anarchist. At the time that I was getting into the Occupy movement, I was really frustrated with American politics. In 2008, I had voted for Barack Obama, and things hadn't really gotten any better. He wasn't a leftist. He wasn't even on the left. He was centrist at best. I mean, I preferred him to the right-wing candidates in competition. He was certainly an improvement over George Bush, but he still did a lot of things that I couldn't agree with, and he wasn't ideal. And it seemed like a lot of the machine was still there chugging along. So I was upset, just like everyone else who came out to Occupy, because we felt underrepresented or unrepresented in democracy. We felt like our single vote didn't really matter and that there should be something more meaningful that we could contribute to this great collective of our community. Now, at the time that I joined Occupy, I was kind of ripe for that kind of thing. I had been in college for about a year and a half. I had really struggled to afford that on multiple levels. And I was feeling a lot of things that the Occupy protesters were talking about. But I also dismissed the categorization that it was mainly a thing that was done by people who were the age I was when it happened, early 20-somethings. Because there were a lot of older folks. There were people that remembered, if not possibly marched as a part of a civil rights protest at some point. Especially since most of my experience with Occupy comes from within North Carolina, and there were a lot of landmarks of the civil rights movement in the places that I occupied. For example, one of the groups that I was most heavily involved with was Occupy Greensboro. Greensboro being the city in North Carolina that has the Woolworths that is credited for starting sit-in protests at whites-only locations. And as a part of my occupying, I actually got to meet one of the members of the men who sat down in that Woolworths that day and refused to leave when they were told. And it was really inspiring to me, but that's a whole nother story that's fascinating in and of itself. But at that time, My understanding of anarchism came from two things in pop culture. The first was the punk rock music of the 1980s and the 1990s. More so probably the 1980s. Punk was dying by the 1990s and being wiped out by grunge, but a lot of the people that stuck around were very anarchist and anti-capitalist. And I got a lot of that anti-capitalist messaging. And another thing that I picked up about anarchism from that was this idea that they were kind of violent revolutionaries in some way, because a lot of punk rock music overplays this idea of this performative violence against the state, at least in the words that they use to describe the system and what should be done about it. And yeah, it's a little hyperbolic, but it really ties into the other representation, which was anarcho-terrorists of the action movies of the 1980s and 1990s. Because it gave me this idea of people who, had the right ideas, because I agreed with a lot of the messaging that I heard in punk rock music, but were a little bit more willing to use violence. Like, I didn't hear anything necessarily about democracy, except that what we have is broken and it needs to be demolished, and chaos needs to be allowed to find a new order that actually fucking works. That was kind of my impression. And what I got from Occupy did not fit that impression. One of the biggest anarchist parts of Occupy that people often cite is the fact that it was a leaderless movement, and the fact that there was no central organization that was telling us what we were protesting against or what was going on. A lot of the ideas started in Occupy Wall Street. For example, the idea of a General Assembly and a lot of the hand gestures that were used that made the General Assembly process work were borrowed from anarchism. Also, some of the ideas of reacting to the 2008 housing crisis and how basically our entire banking and Wall Street sector and investments had been making increasingly risky bets and putting us all at risk just for their own profit, with no regards for how badly they could screw over everybody on the bottom and in the middle and just wipe out people's retirements and savings and everything with the risky bets that they were making and all the dirty, underhanded things that they were doing. And then in 2008, we saw these people get bailed out. We saw these people consolidating power and forming banking monopolies by buying out the smaller banks that didn't get bailed out. We saw them profit from our tax dollars, from ruining the global economy, and it pissed us off. And that's what started Occupy Wall Street, and that's something that was probably talked about intensely at pretty much every General Assembly at some point, and every encampment at some point. And while the media talks a lot about the encampments, I was never a part of one, so that really wasn't something that I can speak to. I visited some while they were still around, one in Raleigh and one in Washington, D.C., and I actually did sleep on the street out in front of a Bank of America as a part of a protest, where we just slept out there and then woke up in the morning and told people why they should cancel their accounts and how Bank of America had contributed to the global economic decline that had cost so many people their livelihoods. And it was a beautiful thing. But the media likes to push this story that that's all that it was about. And honestly, the encampments died out within most of them at least, within maybe 6 months. Occupy Wall Street, I don't remember exactly how long that lasted, and this is why I want to do research for the full-on video. But the North Carolina encampment in Raleigh was actually on private property, really close to the state capitol building. And that was allowed to stay for a long time because no one could kick them out because, the private property owner was cool with it. I think that one lasted for a little over a year. So it outlasted the bulk of the encampments by about 6 months. But the biggest takeaway for me was the General Assembly process. And it was like this handshake that we all knew. I went to so many different Occupy encampments and participated in General Assemblies or so many meetings if the place didn't have an encampment. and it was kind of the same process everywhere, and it was beautiful. There were all these hand gestures, and everyone sat in a circle so that everyone could see everyone and everyone could be seen. And when you had something to contribute, you raised your hand, and a moderator type person would write your name down, and you would be come to in the order that you had raised your hand to be acknowledged. And you would be able to reply directly to things that people said, and it was just this format for having a community conversation that I think is incredibly important and was, as I said earlier, borrowed heavily from anarchism. It was the most democratic process I have ever been a part of, and I have not missed an opportunity to vote, and this by far beat it all. And that, I think, is what makes the Occupy movement so much different than Occupy Wall Street, which did have its General Assemblies, but the Occupy movement, because of the General Assemblies, ended up focusing more on community problems, like local issues, like the gentrification of the neighborhood that we actually had our meetings in when we were in Greensboro. Local specific issues, instead of the larger nationwide, worldwide economic disaster that OWS, Occupy Wall Street, was largely about. Instead, what we would do is we would present ideas or problems. We would present either basically problems or solutions. And if we had a solution, we would form a working group, and that working group would work on that solution and try to implement it within the community. And if we had a problem, we would try to have a discussion to find a solution. And if we could, interested parties would form a working group and try to implement it within the community. That was the idea, to form splinter cells and just spread yourselves out within the community, and all of you trying to affect positive change. Because even as the main stalk of Occupy died, like a dandelion, the seeds of it spread out all over America. Even as the most resilient Occupy groups that I was a part of, that lasted for maybe a year and a half, began to stop having meetings, this was quickly replaced by the still interested parties joining other resistance movements. Things like the Fight for 15 as a group may have never been possible if it wasn't basically seeded from Occupy. People who were successful in Occupy and loved it and didn't want to stop became powerful community organizers that set up local iterations of things like Fight for 15. And there were many other movements that spread after this and because of this, and I can't help but feel, even if they weren't seeded by Occupy, which was kind of a largely white movement, that even movements like Black Lives Matter, which was similarly decentralized, took a lot of inspiration from the Occupy movement. I also don't think that really Antifa would be as big as it was if it hadn't been for a certain amount of groundbreaking from Occupy. At least not in this country. I mean, it's been big in other countries, but it's never really had a presence here until the post-Occupy America. And I think that's for a very good reason. So that's just a few of my takeaways on how my experiences with the Occupy movement broaden my idea of not only what anarchism is, but what democracy is. Because as unbelievable as I would have found it in 2007 or 2008, anarchism is far more democratic of a concept than the democracy of America that I was born and raised to think was the pinnacle of democratic process could ever be. So you can see why I want to do a longer and more researched video on this, where I can share some of the deeper stories, like the North Carolina General Assembly, which was a collaboration between probably like 30 to 50 different Occupy groups from as much as 3 hours away from the Capitol that we were all meeting at, all sharing our ideas together and talking about the various working groups that we'd established and the ways that we'd already tried to or successfully improved our communities, in hopes that the other groups would say, hey, yeah, we can do that too. Yeah, that would help us out as well. It's just the sense of community. That's something that we desperately need, especially in such dividing times. If we all came out to work to in good faith, work together, I don't think it would matter what our party affiliations would be after a while. because we would all be working towards the same goal. Not a Republican goal, not a Democratic goal, but a community goal. Something that really mattered to our individual lives. And I think that that's the kind of participation that we need. And we need like a platform for that. And I'm not sure what that should be. And I'm not sure that it should be inspired by Occupy. But one thing that Occupy definitely taught me is that it needs to be based on the ideas of anarchist democracy, because that is something this country desperately needs. And if you agree, like this video, and please tell me about the American dream, like I asked you to earlier, in the comments if you would like to be involved in the next video. And also tell me if you would really like to see maybe a bigger video, or maybe some smaller videos on some of the more individualized stories from Occupy, because one of the other things I'm doing is I'm digging for a lot of old video that people took, that I took, that has been lost on an old hard drive or something, things that may have got posted online. There's a number of pictures that I have from where my picture was featured in like a newspaper and someone sent it to me as a part of a protest, because I tended to walk towards the front of crowds. Just didn't really like being surrounded on all sides, so I tended to get up towards the front. But I want to get a lot of that media together, because I think it would really help tell some of these stories, because I was involved in working on projects for like 5 different groups, and each one had its own aims in its own place, in its own community. Like in Chapel Hill, which is famously a college town, they were focused on public school tuition prices and protesting at the Board of Governors. In Winston-Salem, which houses one of the American Legislative Exchange Commission's headquarters, we protested out in front of that building to try to raise awareness to the people who were driving by of exactly what ALEC was doing and why this innocuous looking building was anything but. But those are just some of the stories that I want to tell, and this video is probably already getting pretty long, so just let me know in the comments if you want to hear more of that stuff, and if I should do a series of videos on this even. So, thanks for watching. And just like the things that I loved about the General Assembly, I look forward to seeing your input on this. I look forward to hearing what you have to say, and as much as I can, I want to be able to use this channel as a platform to allow anyone to speak, because it's a beautiful feeling to have your voice heard, and I have to thank you, my audience, for that. And I would like to be able to give that back in as much as I can.
Like all of you, I have had...
all of you!
We can repeat it.
Yeah, repeat it. We've been repeating everything. Yeah.
All right, well,
So everybody can hear.
mic check.
Mic